The morning mist clung to the red clay hills surrounding Sanh combat base like a funeral shroud, and Colonel David Edward Lones knew with bone-deep certainty that death was coming for his Marines. It was January 21st, 1968, and the first rocket screamed overhead at 5:30 in the morning, shattering the deceptive quiet that had settled over the remote outpost in South Vietnam's northwestern corner. The base, perched on a plateau 6 miles from the North Vietnamese border, had become a strategic obsession for both sides. For the Americans, it represented a crucial listening post and potential launching pad for operations into Laos. For the North Vietnamese army, it was a thorn in their side that needed to be extracted, violently and completely. The stage was set for what would become one of the longest and most brutal sieges in American military history. Lone stood in the command bunker, his weathered face illuminated by the red glow of communication equipment, as reports flooded in from his scattered outposts. The 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines had encountered a North Vietnamese battalion entrenched between Hill 881 North and Hill 861, and the firefight had been immediate, and the sound of mortars and rocket-propelled grenades echoed across the valley like thunder that refused to fade. Captain Kenneth William Pipes of Bravo Company radioed from Hill 861, his voice crackling through the static. "We've got movement all along the ridgeline, Colonel. Looks like they're trying to cut us off." The young captain had been at Sanh for only 3 months, but he had already learned to read the jungle's deadly moods. The North Vietnamese weren't just probing, they were positioning for something much larger. The intelligence reports that had been filtering in over the past weeks suddenly made terrifying sense. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the architect of France's defeat at Dien Bien Phu 14 years earlier, was reportedly massing forces in the area. The parallels were impossible to ignore, and every Marine at Sanh knew the story of how the French garrisons had been surrounded, bombarded into submission, and ultimately overrun. The question wasn't whether the North Vietnamese would attack in force, but when. As referenced by the U.S. Marine Corps' historical documentation, the battle that began on this date would eventually involve portions of the North Vietnamese Army's 304th, 320th, 324th, and 325th Divisions against the isolated Marine garrison. Sergeant Major John James Dowling moved through the base's defensive positions, checking on the Marines who were frantically improving their foxholes and bunkers. These young men, most barely out of their teens, had volunteered to serve in what many considered a forgotten corner of an increasingly unpopular war. They joked nervously about the incoming fire, calling the rockets Hanoi Specials and pretending that the whistle of artillery didn't make their hearts race. The base itself was a testament to American military engineering and marine ingenuity, carved out of the red laterite soil. It featured a runway capable of handling C-130 transport aircraft, ammunition dumps buried deep underground, and a network of bunkers and trenches that would have impressed the veterans of World War I's Western Front. The Marines had spent months preparing these defenses, never imagining they would soon be tested by one of the most concentrated artillery bombardments in military history. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Edward Ladd commanded the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, positioned on the hills surrounding the main base. His men controlled the high ground that dominated the approaches to Sanh, but they were also the most exposed to enemy attack. As the morning wore on and the intensity of the bombardment increased, Ladd realized that his widely scattered companies might soon be fighting for their very survival. The North Vietnamese artillery was methodical and deadly accurate, suggesting months of careful preparation and reconnaissance. Every major installation within the base seemed to have been pre-registered as a target, and the enemy gunners walked their fire across the American positions. With the precision of a metronome, the main ammunition dump exploded in a spectacular fireball that could be seen for miles, sending shockwaves through the base and eliminating thousands of rounds of desperately needed ordnance. As night fell on January 21st, Colonel Lone stood atop his command bunker and surveyed the damage. Fires burned throughout the base, casting eerie shadows on the faces of Marines who moved like ghosts through the smoke and debris. The enemy had announced their intentions with overwhelming clarity. Sanh would be besieged, bombarded, and ultimately taken. The only question was whether 6,000 Marines and South Vietnamese Rangers could hold out long enough for relief to arrive. The morning of January 22nd brought no respite from the artillery barrage that had begun at dawn the previous day. Colonel Lones moved through his command center like a man possessed, coordinating the defense of 6 isolated hilltop positions, while maintaining communication with Saigon and Da Nang. The North Vietnamese had clearly learned from their successful siege of Dien Bien Phu, and they were applying those lessons with methodical precision against the Marine garrison. Captain Earl Gray Breeding, commanding officer of Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines, found himself trapped on Hill 861 with fewer than 200 men facing what appeared to be an entire North Vietnamese regiment. The enemy had spent the night infiltrating closer to his positions, and the morning revealed fresh fighting positions carved into the hillside, less than 50 meters from his perimeter. Through his binoculars, Breeding could see North Vietnamese soldiers moving with the confidence of men who knew they had their enemy surrounded. The strategic situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Route 9, the only road connecting Khe Sanh to the outside world, had been cut by North Vietnamese forces, leaving the base dependent entirely on aerial resupply. The enemy had positioned anti-aircraft weapons throughout the surrounding hills, turning every supply run into a deadly gauntlet for American pilots. Transport aircraft had to execute steep, spiraling approaches to avoid the surface-to-air missiles and machine gun fire that filled the skies around the base. Major Mirza Munir Beg, the base intelligence officer, had been studying captured documents and prisoner interrogations. That painted an increasingly grim picture. The North Vietnamese had committed at least 20,000 troops to the operation, possibly as many as 40,000, representing the largest concentration of enemy forces in a single area since the war began. General Giap was betting everything on a decisive victory that would demonstrate American vulnerability and potentially influence the upcoming presidential election in the United States. The Marines on the isolated hilltops surrounding Khe Sanh found themselves fighting a different kind of war than their counterparts in the main base. Lieutenant Richard Allen Foley led the 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company on Hill 881 North, where his men faced nightly probing attacks and constant sniper fire. The North Vietnamese would wait until the Marines were focused on incoming artillery, then rush forward under cover of the explosions, only to melt back into the jungle when the defenders responded. Communications between the scattered positions became increasingly difficult as the North Vietnamese jammed radio frequencies and severed telephone lines. Colonel Lones was forced to rely on visual signals and brave radio operators who moved between positions under cover of darkness. The isolation was psychological as well as physical, as each unit began to feel that they were fighting their own private war against an invisible enemy that seemed to know their every move. The North Vietnamese came in waves, using sappers to breach the defensive wire while assault troops followed closely behind. With automatic weapons and grenades, Sergeant Robert Franklin Hayes led the defense of the eastern perimeter, where the North Vietnamese concentrated their main effort. His squad had been reduced to fewer than 8 men over the previous 2 days, but they fought with the desperation of Marines who knew that retreat meant death. The enemy soldiers were well-trained and fearless, many of them veterans of previous campaigns against the French and South Vietnamese forces. The battle for Hill 861 raged until dawn, with the outcome hanging in the balance for several terrifying hours. American artillery from the main base provided crucial support, but the rounds had to be called in danger close to the Marine positions to be effective against the attacking North Vietnamese. Several times during the night, Breeding thought his position would be overrun, but his Marines held on through sheer determination and superior firepower. As the sun rose on January 24th, the Marines counted their losses and prepared for the next attack. Hill 861 remained in American hands, but barely, and everyone knew that the North Vietnamese would return the following night with even more men and better tactics. The siege of Khe Sanh had entered its deadliest phase, and the outcome remained very much in doubt. The psychological pressure was perhaps even worse than the physical danger. The Marines were trapped in a bubble of violence surrounded by an enemy they rarely saw, but always felt. Sleep became impossible except in brief, exhausted intervals between bombardments. Men who had been steady under fire in previous battles began to show signs of combat fatigue, their nerves frayed by the constant stress of knowing that death could arrive without warning from any direction. Colonel Lones requested immediate reinforcement, but the nearest American units were hundreds of miles away and already committed to other operations. The Marines at Khe Sanh would have to hold on with what they had, supported only by air power and artillery from distant fire bases. The question was no longer whether they could win, but whether they could survive long enough for the strategic situation to change in their favor. The third week of the siege brought a new dimension of horror to the Marines trapped at Khe Sanh. North Vietnamese artillery units had registered every square meter of the base. With mathematical precision, and their gunners could drop shells within feet of any target they chose. Colonel Lones had moved his command post 3 times in as many days, each location becoming untenable as enemy observers adjusted their fire. To target American leadership positions, Captain James Henry Baird commanded the base's heavy mortar battery, and his Marines had become experts at counter-battery fire during the long siege. Every time the North Vietnamese guns opened up, Baird's crews would race to their weapons and attempt to silence the enemy positions. It was deadly work, conducted under constant observation by North Vietnamese spotters who called in immediate retaliation against any American weapon that revealed its position. The arrival of massive Boeing B-52 Stratofortress bombers marked a new phase in the battle for Khe Sanh. Operation Niagara, as the strategic bombing campaign was designated, would eventually drop nearly 100,000 tons of ordnance on the areas surrounding the Marine base. The psychological effect of the bombing was profound, as each B-52 strike created explosions that could be felt miles away and left craters large enough to swallow buildings. Lieutenant Colonel James Brewer Wilkinson commanded the 1st Battalion, 13th Marines, providing artillery support for the entire Khe Sanh area of operations. His gunners fired more than 100,000 rounds during the siege, often at targets so close to friendly positions that the Marines in the front lines could feel the heat from the explosions. Wilkinson's men worked around the clock, their gun barrels glowing red-hot from constant use, while North Vietnamese counter-battery fire sought to eliminate their positions. The Marines on the isolated hilltops lived in a world of constant terror, punctuated by moments of absolute chaos. Corpsman 3rd Class Michael Anthony Rodriguez had volunteered to serve with the infantry, and he found himself treating wounds that would have been fatal in any previous war. The combination of modern weapons and primitive conditions created injuries that challenged even experienced medical personnel, and Rodriguez often worked on wounded Marines while enemy fire continued to fall around their positions. Supply runs to the hilltop positions became virtual suicide missions as North Vietnamese gunners learned to predict American helicopter schedules. Pilots developed new tactics, approaching their landing zones at extreme low altitude and high speed, dropping off supplies and wounded Marines in a matter of seconds before racing away through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire. Many helicopters never made it back to base, their crews joining the growing list of casualties that mounted with each passing day. The North Vietnamese had learned to exploit American patterns and procedures, timing their attacks to coincide with supply runs and shift changes. They had infiltrated observation teams close enough to the Marine positions to monitor radio communications and movement patterns, allowing them to anticipate American responses to their attacks. The siege was becoming a deadly chess match between experienced commanders who understood that one mistake could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. Major Roger Harry Neiman served as the base operations officer, coordinating the complex logistics required to keep 6,000 Marines supplied with ammunition, food, and medical supplies under impossible conditions. Every item that entered Khe Sanh had to be flown in under fire, and Neiman had to balance the immediate needs of combat units against the long-term requirements of sustaining a siege that showed no signs of ending. The weather became another enemy as the northeast monsoon brought low clouds and heavy rain that grounded aircraft for days at a time. During these periods, the Marines at Khe Sanh were completely cut off from the outside world, dependent on their dwindling stocks of ammunition and rations, while North Vietnamese forces used the poor visibility to move closer to American positions. The psychological pressure of isolation combined with physical deprivation to push many Marines to the breaking point. Sergeant 1st Class David Allen Dorman led a reconnaissance patrol that discovered North Vietnamese forces had constructed an elaborate tunnel system extending almost to the perimeter of the main base. The enemy had spent months digging these tunnels, using them to move supplies and personnel undetected, while preparing for what appeared to be a major assault on the Marine positions. The discovery confirmed what many officers had suspected. The North Vietnamese were preparing for a final, decisive attack that would crush the Marine garrison. As February began, the Marines at Khe Sanh had been under siege for 2 weeks, and their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Casualties mounted daily from artillery fire and probing attacks, while resupply missions became more dangerous as North Vietnamese anti-aircraft defenses improved. The enemy was demonstrating a level of patience and preparation that impressed even veteran Marine officers who had fought in World War II and Korea. The international media had begun to focus attention on Khe Sanh, comparing the siege to historical disasters like Dien Bien Phu and the Alamo. President Lyndon Baines Johnson reportedly kept a scale model of the base, In the White House Situation Room, studying the tactical situation and demanding hourly updates from the Pentagon, the political implications of losing Sanh could potentially end the Johnson presidency and change the entire course of American involvement in Vietnam. The morning of January 30th brought disturbing intelligence reports that would fundamentally change the strategic picture surrounding Sanh. As Colonel Lone studied the latest reconnaissance photographs, showing continued North Vietnamese buildup around his positions, radio communications from throughout South Vietnam began reporting coordinated attacks on major cities and installations. The Tet Offensive had begun, and suddenly the siege of Sanh appeared to be part of a much larger and more complex enemy strategy. Major General Rathon McClure Tompkins, commanding the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, had been predicting for weeks that Sanh was a diversion designed to draw American forces away from more valuable targets. The coordinated attacks on Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, and dozens of other cities and towns confirmed his suspicions, but the realization came too late to affect the deployment of American forces. The full divisions had been committed to the relief of Sanh, exactly as General Giap had planned. Captain Harry Milliard Jenkins commanded Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, positioned on Hill 950, the most isolated of the hilltop positions surrounding the main base. His Marines had been under constant pressure for more than a week, and Jenkins could see that his men were reaching the limits of their endurance. The combination of sleep deprivation, constant stress, and inadequate food was taking a toll that could not be measured in casualty reports. The news of the Tet Offensive reached the Marines at Sanh through fragmented radio transmissions and conversations with helicopter crews. The realization that they might be fighting a secondary battle, while the real war was being decided elsewhere, created a sense of frustration and abandonment that was almost as demoralizing as the constant enemy fire. Many Marines began to question whether their sacrifice would ultimately matter. In the larger context of the Vietnam conflict, Lieutenant Colonel John Freeman Mitchell commanded the 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines, which held the critical eastern approaches to Sanh combat base. His Marines had constructed an elaborate network of bunkers and trenches that resembled the trench systems of World War I, complete with communication tunnels and underground supply storage. The position was virtually impregnable to direct assault, but Mitchell knew that his men could not hold indefinitely against the concentrated artillery fire that fell on their positions every day. The psychological warfare campaign conducted by the North Vietnamese became increasingly sophisticated as the siege continued. Enemy loudspeakers broadcast propaganda messages in English, targeting specific Marine units by name and describing in detail the fate that awaited them if they continued to resist. The broadcasts were particularly effective during the long nights, when exhausted Marines stood watch in their fighting positions, alone with their thoughts and fears. Corporal Timothy Patrick O'Brien had enlisted in the Marines, straight out of high school in rural Iowa, and he found himself manning a machine gun position that faced north toward the demilitarized zone. His squad had been reduced to 4 men over the course of the siege, and O'Brien had taken command when his sergeant was wounded by mortar fire. At 19 years old, he was responsible for defending a section of perimeter that might determine the fate of the entire base. The arrival of newspaper correspondents and television crews created additional complications for the Marine commanders. The media wanted access to combat zones and frontline positions, but their presence endangered both themselves and the Marines who were responsible for their safety. Colonel Lones found himself balancing the demands of battlefield security against the political necessity of demonstrating American resolve to the domestic audience. The North Vietnamese demonstrated their ability to coordinate complex operations when they launched simultaneous attacks on 3 separate hilltop positions. On the night of February 4th, the attacks were carefully timed to prevent American forces from shifting support between threatened areas, and they featured new tactics that suggested extensive planning and preparation. Sergeant Major William Robert Lee served as the senior enlisted advisor to Colonel Lones, and his experience in Korea and earlier campaigns in Vietnam provided valuable perspective on the developing tactical situation. Lee had seen American forces survive desperate situations through superior leadership and unit cohesion, but he was concerned about the long-term effects of the siege on Marine morale and combat effectiveness. The constant stress was creating psychological casualties that would not appear in the official casualty reports. The logistical situation became increasingly critical as North Vietnamese anti-aircraft fire began to take a heavy toll on American supply aircraft. Transport planes had to execute increasingly dangerous approaches to the airstrip at Sanh, and several were shot down while attempting to deliver crucial supplies to the besieged Marines. The loss of each aircraft not only eliminated desperately needed supplies, but also reduced the fleet available for future resupply missions. As February progressed, intelligence reports indicated that the North Vietnamese were preparing for a major offensive that would coincide with the Tet holiday celebrations throughout South Vietnam. The Marines at Sanh found themselves in the peculiar position of being both participants in and observers of a strategic deception that was playing out on a national scale. Their role as the bait in General Giap's trap did not diminish their determination to hold their positions, but it added a bitter irony to their desperate struggle for survival. The weather continued to play a crucial role in the battle, with low clouds and heavy rain grounding American aircraft for extended periods, while providing cover for North Vietnamese troop movements. During these periods of poor visibility, the Marines could hear enemy forces moving in the jungle around their positions, but they were unable to call in airstrikes or artillery support. The psychological pressure of knowing that the enemy was massing for attack, while being unable to respond, was almost unbearable. By mid-February, the Marines at Sanh had endured nearly 4 weeks of constant bombardment, and the strain was beginning to show in ways that went beyond simple casualty figures. Captain Bruce Barry Clark, the base medical officer, reported an alarming increase in cases of combat fatigue, shell shock, and what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who had performed heroically under fire were beginning to break down under the relentless pressure of a siege that seemed to have no end. Rather than launching massive assaults that might be repelled decisively, they conducted a series of probing attacks and harassment operations designed to keep the Marines in a constant state of alert. Sleep became impossible except in brief intervals, and men began to hallucinate from exhaustion and stress. The enemy had learned that destroying American morale might be more effective than destroying American positions. Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth John Houghton commanded the helicopter squadrons, tasked with resupplying the isolated hilltop positions, and his pilots were paying a terrible price for their courage. HMM 364 had lost 6 aircraft in 2 weeks, with crews either killed or captured by North Vietnamese forces. Each mission required pilots to fly through concentrated anti-aircraft fire, while carrying external loads that made their helicopters dangerously unstable and slow. The battle for Hill 861 reached its climax on February 14th, when North Vietnamese forces launched their most determined assault of the siege. Captain Breeding's Marines had been reinforced by a platoon from Delta Company, but they still faced overwhelming odds as 3 enemy battalions attacked their positions simultaneously. The fighting was hand-to-hand combat in many cases, with Marines and North Vietnamese soldiers grappling in the mud and debris of shattered bunkers. Sergeant James Edward Kaler led the counterattack that saved the northeastern corner of Hill 861's perimeter, when North Vietnamese sappers breached the defensive wire and established positions inside the Marine compound. His squad fought room by room through the bunker complex, using grenades and small arms fired to clear enemy soldiers from positions they had occupied for several hours. The fighting continued until dawn, with the outcome decided by individual acts of heroism that would never appear in official reports. The strategic bombing campaign was reaching its peak intensity, with B-52 strikes occurring every 90 minutes around the clock. The massive bombers flew missions directly from bases in Thailand and Guam, delivering their payloads with unprecedented accuracy thanks to ground-based radar guidance systems. The North Vietnamese responded by dispersing their forces and moving operations underground, but the psychological effect of the bombing was undeniable. Colonel Lones had been requesting permission to abandon some of the more exposed hilltop positions, but his superiors in Saigon insisted that every piece of ground be held regardless of cost. The political symbolism of Sanh had become more important than its tactical value, and Marines were dying to maintain positions that served no military purpose other than denying them to the enemy. The disconnect between strategic reality and political necessity was becoming increasingly apparent to the officers who had to implement these policies. Major Charles Edward Southwell commanded the base's Artillery Fire Direction Center, coordinating the complex missions required to support 6 separate defensive positions, while avoiding friendly fire incidents. His Marines fired more than 150,000 rounds during February alone, often in support of positions that were under such intense pressure that forward observers could not effectively adjust fire. The guns were beginning to show signs of wear from constant use, and replacement barrels were in critically short supply. The arrival of Tet refugees from the cities added another complication to an already desperate situation. Thousands of Vietnamese civilians had fled the fighting in urban areas, many seeking sanctuary at American military installations like Khe Sanh. The Marines were required to provide security and humanitarian assistance to these refugees, while maintaining their defensive positions against North Vietnamese attacks. The additional burden strained resources that were already stretched to the breaking point. Communications with the outside world became increasingly sporadic, as North Vietnamese forces systematically targeted radio relay stations and communication facilities throughout the region. Colonel Lones found himself cut off from higher headquarters for hours at a time, forced to make tactical decisions based on incomplete information and outdated intelligence reports. The isolation was both physical and psychological, creating a sense that the Marines at Khe Sanh were fighting their own private war. Lance Corporal Richard Allen Thompson had been at Khe Sanh for only 6 weeks when the siege began, but he had aged years in the crucible of constant combat. His machine gun team held a section of perimeter that faced the most likely avenue of North Vietnamese approach, and they had repelled dozens of probing attacks during the long siege. Thompson had learned to sleep while standing up and to identify different types of enemy weapons by their sound, skills that would serve him well if he survived the ordeal. The medical situation was becoming critical as supplies of morphine, antibiotics, and surgical equipment dwindled despite desperate attempts to resupply the base. Navy corpsmen were performing major surgery in underground bunkers, while enemy artillery fire shook dirt from the ceiling onto their patients. Many wounded Marines who might have survived with proper medical care were dying from infections and complications that could have been prevented under normal conditions. As February drew to a close, intelligence reports suggested that the North Vietnamese were preparing for a final assault that would either crush the Marine garrison or force them to abandon their positions. General Giap had committed his most experienced divisions to the operation, and prisoners reported that political officers were promising decisive victory within days. The Marines at Khe Sanh prepared for what might be the last battle of the longest siege in their unit's history. The first week of March brought a fundamental shift in the tactical situation at Khe Sanh, as American air power was unleashed with unprecedented intensity. Operation Niagara reached its crescendo with B-52 strikes occurring every 90 minutes, supported by tactical aircraft from Marine, Navy, and Air Force units operating from bases throughout Southeast Asia. The sustained bombing campaign was unlike anything previously seen in military history, and its effects on North Vietnamese forces were becoming increasingly apparent. General William Childs Westmoreland had committed the full resources of Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, to the relief of Khe Sanh, despite growing criticism that the base served no strategic purpose worth the enormous cost in men and materiel. Operation Pegasus was already in the planning stages, involving the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile and elements of the South Vietnamese Army, in a coordinated advance toward the besieged Marine base. The operation would require perfect timing and coordination between ground forces, artillery, and air support. Captain Donald Ray Phillips commanded Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 26th Marines on Hill 881, where his Marines had constructed an underground bunker system that resembled the fortifications of World War I's Western Front. Phillips had been wounded twice during the siege, but refused evacuation, knowing that his experience and leadership were crucial to his unit's survival. His company had been reduced to fewer than 80 men, but they controlled one of the key terrain features that dominated the approaches to Khe Sanh. The psychological effects of the prolonged siege were becoming increasingly evident among both Marine and North Vietnamese forces. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy desertion rates were increasing dramatically as the bombing campaign took its toll on morale and unit cohesion. Some North Vietnamese prisoners reported that entire companies had been destroyed by B-52 strikes, with survivors scattered throughout the jungle without effective command or communication. With higher headquarters, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Damon Hampton commanded the 1st Battalion, 13th Marines, the primary artillery unit supporting the Khe Sanh garrison. His howitzers had fired more than 200,000 rounds since the siege began, and the barrels were showing dangerous signs of wear from constant use. Hampton's Marines worked around the clock to maintain their weapons, while enemy counter-battery fire systematically targeted their positions. Several guns had been destroyed or damaged, reducing the unit's ability to provide effective support to the infantry. The logistical achievement required to sustain the siege was remarkable by any standard, with transport aircraft flying missions through some of the most heavily defended airspace in military history. C-130 crews developed new tactics for approaching Khe San's airstrip, including a steep spiral descent that reduced exposure to anti-aircraft fire, but required exceptional pilot skill to execute safely. Many aircraft were damaged by enemy fire, and several were lost with their crews during the dangerous supply missions. Sergeant First Class Robert William Arota led a reconnaissance patrol that penetrated North Vietnamese lines to gather intelligence on enemy positions and intentions. His Marines discovered that the enemy had constructed an elaborate network of tunnels and bunkers extending for miles around Khe Sanh, suggesting preparations for a prolonged siege that might last several more months. The discovery confirmed American intelligence estimates that the North Vietnamese had committed massive resources to the operation. The Marines on the isolated hilltops had developed their own tactics for surviving the daily artillery bombardments that marked the rhythm of life during the siege. Experienced veterans could identify different types of enemy weapons by their sound and predict where shells would impact based on the trajectory of incoming rounds. This knowledge meant the difference between life and death for Marines, who had to decide in split seconds whether to seek cover or continue moving toward their objectives. Captain William Howard Dabney commanded India Company, 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines on Hill 881 North, the position closest to the North Vietnamese border and therefore most vulnerable to enemy attack. His Marines had repelled dozens of probing attacks during the siege, but Dabney could see that enemy forces were massing for what appeared to be a major assault. Intelligence reports indicated that the North Vietnamese regiments were positioned within striking distance of his isolated position. The weather began to improve in early March, allowing American aircraft to increase the tempo of operations against North Vietnamese positions. Fighter bombers flew close air support missions that brought them within range of enemy small arms fire, but the pilots were willing to accept the risk to provide accurate fire support to the besieged Marines. The improved visibility also revealed the extent of damage caused by weeks of bombing, with entire hillsides stripped bare of vegetation and pockmarked with bomb craters. Radio intercepts indicated that North Vietnamese commanders were under increasing pressure from Hanoi to achieve decisive results at Khe Sanh before American reinforcements could arrive. Political officers reported that the prolonged siege was consuming resources needed for operations elsewhere in South Vietnam, and some units were being withdrawn from the Khe Sanh area to reinforce other fronts. The strategic balance was beginning to shift in favor of the Americans, but the immediate tactical situation remained desperate for the Marines on the isolated hilltops. The arrival of additional medical personnel and supplies improved the treatment available for wounded Marines, but conditions in the base hospital remained primitive by any standard. Navy doctors performed major surgery in underground bunkers, while enemy artillery fire continued to fall on the base, and many procedures were conducted without adequate anesthesia or surgical equipment. The mortality rate for serious wounds was much higher than in previous conflicts, reflecting the difficulty of providing medical care under combat conditions. As March progressed, intelligence reports suggested that the North Vietnamese were beginning to withdraw some of their forces from the Khe Sanh area, possibly in response to the devastating effects of the American bombing campaign. Captured documents indicated that several enemy units had suffered casualties exceeding 50%, and effective command and control had broken down in some areas. The siege that had seemed destined to end in American defeat was slowly turning in favor of the Marines, who had endured 11 weeks of hell. The morning of April 1st, 1968, dawned clear and quiet over Khe Sanh for the first time in 7 days, as if the Vietnamese jungle itself was holding its breath. After the longest and most brutal siege in Marine Corps' history, Colonel Lone stood on the roof of his battered command bunker, surveying a landscape that had been transformed by war into something resembling the surface of an alien planet. Where once green hills had rolled toward the horizon, now only red earth and shattered stumps remained, punctuated by thousands of bomb craters that gave the terrain the appearance of a moonscape. The sound of approaching helicopters from the east announced the arrival of the 1st Cavalry Division, spearheading Operation Pegasus under the command of Major General John Joseph Tolson III. The airmobile troops landed in formation just outside the defensive perimeter, their clean uniforms and freshly serviced equipment a stark contrast to the hollow-eyed Marines, who had held Khe Sanh against impossible odds. The symbolic handshake between Tolson and Lones marked the official end of the siege, but for the Marines who had endured the ordeal, the psychological scars would last a lifetime. Captain Dabney's India Company was among the last to be relieved, having held Hill 881 North against repeated North Vietnamese assaults. Throughout the siege, His Marines had been reduced to fewer than 60 effective fighters, but they had never yielded an inch of ground to an enemy that had outnumbered them by more than 10 to 1. As Dabney prepared to turn over his positions to the relief force, he reflected on the transformation that his men had undergone during their trial by fire. The statistics of the siege were staggering by any measure, with American forces having delivered more than 100,000 tons of ordnance on the areas surrounding Sanh during the 7-to-7-day battle. According to records maintained by the U.S. Marine Corps, nearly 25,000 tactical air sorties were flown in support of the garrison, making Sanh the most heavily bombed target. In military history, the North Vietnamese had paid a terrible price for their attempt to recreate the victory at Dien Bien Phu, with intelligence estimates suggesting casualties in the thousands. Sergeant Major Dowling had survived the entire siege, moving between defensive positions under fire to maintain morale and coordinate the desperate defense of the base. His presence had been crucial during the darkest moments of the battle, when exhausted Marines questioned whether they could hold out another day against the relentless North Vietnamese pressure. The senior enlisted Marine had become a legend among the younger troops, who credited his leadership with their survival through the longest siege in Marine Corps history. The final North Vietnamese attack had come on March 22nd, when elements of the 304th Division launched a desperate assault against the southeastern perimeter of the main base. The attack was repelled by concentrated artillery fire and close air support, but it demonstrated that enemy forces remained capable of offensive operations. Despite weeks of continuous bombing, the failure of this final assault appeared to convince North Vietnamese commanders that Sanh could not be taken by direct assault. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's 2nd Battalion had suffered the highest casualties of any unit during the siege, with more than 40.